Hello and welcome to Mormons, Mystics, and Muons. Alden, it's been a little while since we've recorded an episode, probably a month or so.
Yeah, it has.
And
life got a little crazy there for a second.
Yeah. But I've been thinking about stuff, and what have I been doing in the meantime? I listened to maybe 4 or 5 of the Sunstone sessions, Sunstone Symposium sessions. And I think that would be an interesting episode, just kind of do a recap on some of the stuff there. I listened to I don't know if I told you there's one on quantum physics, one on from soft swapping to soaking, slippery slopes and sexuality. That was on ethical non-monogamy. And September 6 updates was interesting. And then Stephen Fleming, he had a presentation on the connection between Joseph Smith and Jane Lead, who was an English mystic and was into non-duality and Melchizedek priesthood and golden books and restorations of gospels. And but then also Plato as well. And it was interesting because whenever he kept saying, because he's kind of considered an apologist. I think he's on Fair LDS's website, but he's an active Mormon. He just got released as a bishop. But whenever he said that he felt like Plato was a source for Joseph Smith, he was like, I know this sounds crazy, but it's funny because to me, that doesn't sound crazy at all.
No.
But maybe for some people it does. So listen to that. I'm trying to think of, I don't know if there. And the panel on psychedelics with Alex. And did you listen to that?
I haven't yet. No.
Okay. I think that would be an interesting episode. Then I've also been making it 2/3 of the way through Method Infinite, which is the book on Freemasonry and Mormonism by Shew-Stone, Bruno, and Nick Latursky, and I think there's a third author. But that's been interesting. Nothing mind-blowing like Quinn's book on early Mormonism and the magic worldview.
Mm-hmm.
But it is interesting on Freemasonry and basically how it's about mysticism and enlightenment, but it doesn't go into any so far it hasn't gone into descriptions of mystical states or any connection with psychedelics or whatnot. But Brandon Crockett just interviewed Shew Bruno on Roughly Stoned for the Mormons on Mushrooms podcast. That was an interesting podcast. So he said, I think in that episode, he said they were going to have somebody on that was going to make a connection between Freemasonry and psychedelics. So that's been what's been on my Mormon mystical plate.
You've been busy on the Mormon mystical plate. Yeah, my month has definitely not been as busy as yours in that regard, with some school stuff going on. I have been reading one book that's interesting though, which is called Becoming Michelangelo. And I'll need to, it's by Alan Pescuzzi, Becoming Michelangelo. Just this fascinating account of this art historian who's also an artist, this Michael Pescuzzi, who basically did an apprenticeship of Michelangelo, in his words. He was able to recreate Michelangelo's apprenticeship experience through these ancient journals and writings of the guild masters of the day during the Renaissance, where Michelangelo was up and coming. And what's fascinating is how much Michelangelo wanted to put himself on a pedestal for after he died, that he wanted people to believe that he had God-given, godlike talent, kind of at a whim.
Interesting.
Instead of this rigorous process. And in the book, he details that he was talented, no doubt, and he got a lot of compliments from those who he apprenticed for, the masters of the day. Even as a teenager, he could compete with them in terms of rendering detail and quality of image and all of this. And this guy goes through the apprenticeship process of Michelangelo and actually draws himself, like does the studies himself, and improves his art dramatically. I haven't finished it, but it's pretty interesting.
And is it just for fun that you picked it up?
Yeah, I try to read something that I'm like just throwing something into the mix that's maybe unusual or catches my attention otherwise. And that's about all I could do in this month with class and everything going on. Had to take a break from the mysticism for a minute.
There's another thing that I don't think I mentioned this to you, and I can't remember the details, but a few weeks back I was listening to the Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast, Schwepp, which is pretty good. Alex had recommended that. But there was one part that sounds very familiar. And it should sound very familiar to Mormons. And we're going to listen to Terence McKenna today. And there's a bunch of things that pop up that, again, are funny like this and should make you start to question why there are these similarities. But this one was this Ficino guy, I think, some Italian, like 1600s or something. But he was like integrating, I think, trying to integrate like esotericism and Christianity and Plato. And anyway, somebody around that time believed that what was it? I think it was, they were saying that Moses had given that there were two layers of commandments that Moses had been given, and the higher order was like basically mysticism and esotericism, but then the lower order was Christianity. So I was like, that sounds like what we were told Mormonism.
Wow.
The first time that Moses came down and then broke the commandments.
That'd be interesting if there was some evidence of that.
Yeah, and I don't know if there is any evidence, but I think it just shows that the ideas that popped up in early Mormonism, like there's kind of a rebranding or an integration of stuff that had been around. Today we're going to listen to and comment on, I was thinking this should be like Mystery Science Theater, but we should call it Mysteries Science Theater 2000, because the mysteries cults.
2,600.
We're going to listen to Terence McKenna, which I haven't listened to a lot of his stuff. I've listened to a couple things, but I know a few people that I respect really talk about him a lot. So I've started listening to him a bit more, and I think he's pretty kind of just self-taught, polymath, kind of a trailblazer in psychedelics,
eccentric
philosophy.
Yeah, very eccentric character, and someone who I've listened to quite a bit of just recordings from those kind of working seminar sessions he would do, mostly on YouTube and podcast kind of situations, just listening to him, and definitely an integrator, someone who was trying to make as many connections as possible. I think he, went a little off course at times, as we all do. But for the most part, I think he was prophetic in a lot of what he said.
Well, it's funny because I was listening to, I think it was his last interview, where he's talking about like, this is what, he's talking about like this, things are so weird. He's like, things are getting so weird, and they're getting so weird that like, we have to start talking about how weird they are in society. And, he's like, and the mushrooms told me like, this is what it looks like when a race prepares to depart for the stars, and like we're escaping the Newtonian prison of physics. And, he talks in this very 5D other dimensional way. And sometimes it scares me how much what he says makes complete sense to me, and I'm like, and so, but
well, in
I
the
also
context
understand
in
that.
which he was saying it, which was like the 90s, basically, most of the 90s, where we look now, it's kind of like, wow, if only he was alive today, what would he be saying? What would
Mhm.
he
Yeah,
be integrating? What would he be seeing?
yeah, and I think one of the most difficult parts of like seeing the big picture is assessing where society is and how quickly or slowly things are going to happen. Because back then he was talking about the end of the Mayan calendar and like maybe 2012 or something. And I think like profound shifts are happening. I think looking back, we'll be surprised at how quickly things change. But looking forward, it sometimes feels like things are happening slowly.
Yeah.
But so this was, I was listening to, I don't know why I searched this up, but somehow I found this. I think it was recorded or included in the Alchemical Mind podcasters. But it's just a recording of Terence McKenna. And as I was listening to it, I thought, oh, yeah, there's a lot of similarities to a lot of relevant things to Mormonism, specifically the mystical origins of Mormonism. And for me, I'm just super curious to hear how like faithful traditional believing members could reconcile all these connections, as well as like the bitter, skeptical, anti-materialist atheist,
Yeah.
because there's just too many weird connections to not have some sort of metaphysical,
Must be addressed. Yeah.
yeah. But I think people don't want to touch it, so we'll play it and then we'll pause it as we have things to say. And yeah.
Well, today's thing is sort of a return to a more orthodox educational kind of mode, hopefully not to such a degree that it's boring. But the agenda is to talk about...
I should say this is on basically magic and Hermeticism, kind of the overlap with Christianity.
Hermeticism and alchemy, the way in which this tradition, which is counterintuitive and heterodox, if not heretical from the point of view of Christianity, and what it can mean for the present, what it means for the psychedelic experience, what it means for the notion of the end of history, and how the loss of this point of view has probably done us a certain amount of damage. The great tension in the Middle Ages was between the late Middle Ages, was between the magical schema, the magical view of human beings, and the Christian view. And the Christian view is very strongly marked by the idea that of man's fall, that we screwed up early on, and somehow then, by virtue of that, we're forced into a secondary position in the cosmic drama. We are doing penance as we speak. The world is a vale of tears. The lot of human beings is to till hard land, and we are cursed unto the 19th generation or something like that by the fall of our first parents. And we can be redeemed. I'm giving you the Christian rap. We can be redeemed through Christ, but we don't deserve it. It is, if you are saved, it is because there is a kind of a hand extended to you from a merciful God who is willing to overlook your wormy nature and draw you up in spite of yourself. And this is deep in us, no matter how Whether you may not think you've bought in because you're black or because you're Chinese or something, but it's just in the air we breathe. It's what Western civilization makes you think, whether you want to think it or not. Even if you don't come out of these traditions, for us, the concept of that you've got to pay your dues. Human beings are co-partners with deity.
So I think that's an interesting point, and this first came to my attention listening to Alan Watts talking about this idea of like fallen man, how paradoxical and absurd it is, because we just in Western culture really inherently don't trust ourselves, and if we're fallen and broken, like there's no way around it. We can't police ourselves, and so it's just this. And then he contrasted that to Eastern cultures where the kind of natural state is actually a positive state. And I find this very ingrained in Western culture. And it's interesting, as part of some of these groups on Mormonism and Western esotericism, or like mysticism overlapping with Mormonism. And there's a group of people that have had mystical, non-dual, transcendent experiences, whether endogenous, psychedelics, whatever. And some of those view it from like this Christian, this dual good and evil perspective, and they get even more polarized of like, we need to vanquish evil and like we need to fight Satan more, because I think at the core there's still this like shame and self-loathing, and that's projected outwards. It's like we need to have a hell, another, we need to be we need to feel some purpose, and I think that's been interesting. So I remember perusing one of these guys' page, and stuff that who's being things that he had posted about like pornographers should be put in jail and stuff, like really extreme stuff, like just this very puritanical focus on purity and goodness, and so whereas other people that have mystical non-dual experiences, if it's from the context of like meditation or psychedelics, as much as it's not a cure-all and there could be bad outcomes with psychedelics, I think one of the benefits from people that I hear that have entered this space from it is because it kind of lifts the veil of this idea that you're getting this experience because of something you did, how special you are, how you were, you kept the commandments. Whereas if you were like fasting for days and praying and then you see Jesus or whatever, then like it's much easier, I think, to get a distorted view. But I think this shame, guilt goes deep. And I was thinking the other day I've been thinking a lot about the Garden of Eden and the symbolism in there, and how strict the church is about how literal they are about certain things, like how we talk in when we're studying a New Testament about the Pharisees, and how off the mark they were, while the church is also concerned with the length of your sleeves and your shorts. And I was like, and the Garden of Eden, like, who was first concerned about modesty? Like it was Satan. Like Satan was the one that said, hey, you guys are naked, like you need to cover up because that's not good. And viewing the Garden of Eden from a symbolic, like a Jungian perspective of like, oh, this is Adam and Eve created God and they also created Satan. And so they created this the shame and the guilt that they feel, it's from themselves. Satan is a part of themselves, is telling them, like, you did something wrong, you're not worthy, you need to cover yourself up. And then they hear the same message from God too. It's like, you need Christ to, like, you're nothing, you need the atonement. And we're going to make you a cloak, skin, to cover your nakedness. And yeah, the last thing is, I think that it's interesting that you can, from my perspective, I do have a lot of reverence for Christ, or at least the archetype. I don't know how much is historical or not. But the Bible actually makes so much more sense now than it ever did. And I'm like, like, this is what he was saying. This is like what he meant. And like all the mindfulness and the kind of the Eastern philosophy and the esoteric stuff just pops out at you. And especially Mormon's view of the Garden of Gethsemane, of like, this is an experience where he felt all pain and suffering of all time, all people and all things, experience everything that you would have experienced. I was like, this is exactly like the description of a mystical experience. And like research studies on psychedelics is like transcending time and space and feeling all things. And that, he wasn't like paying some debt. But that is an experience that everybody can have. And this Christ, the return of Christ, is symbolically viewed as like, it's the return of Christ consciousness, is this idea that we can actually become like him, become one with the Father in like a non-dual sense. So that's very similar, but in the other sense, it's such a very heretical to some people that, they want to back away from Mormonism. But the minute you talk about how like maybe Christ had a mystical experience and he didn't pay for your sins, like some people get very offended by that because they feel like they need to hold on to that. Like they need to believe that they're fallen and that somebody's paid for it, because they don't feel like it's so ingrained that they're not worthy themselves.
Yeah. Wow, you packed a lot in there, Gabe, and I had a lot of thoughts as you were talking about that, and what Terence was referencing, kind of telling this alternative narrative of almost like a choose your own adventure, or what maybe a branch of what could have been, is if Christianity would have gone down this more mystical or magical kind of path. There's evidence in Gnostic Christianity and early forms of Christianity that there was a lot more, I think, appreciation of the symbolism of it all, the alchemical traditions that would ascribe like this Christ consciousness as an aspect of an individual person, that it's up to each one of us. It's I think of like Freud's theory of superego, ego, and id, where id is the base desires, the carnal appetites, based on this needs, the satisfaction drive to satisfy these cravings. The superego is maybe like this heavenly Father, this like overarching God, this imposition of expectations of societal order and in discipline, in periods of waiting for those needs to be satiated. And this ego is this mediator between them, like a Jesus Christ who comes down and mediates between the negative polarity and the positive polarity. And that for each one of us, we have all of them in us, and we're at some level needing to walk that more medium line of being an individual person in a world where there's imposition, but yet there's something underneath us driving us. And Christ is the uprightness in approaching those two forces, the higher road. There's so many ways to interpret. And that's, like you were saying, Jesus's words and what he did it's enigmatic in some ways because it can traverse cultures where people can experience it in different ways. The people that are using ayahuasca in Brazil and encountering Christ through that, it's very pliable. The Christian message is very pliable. And I think one thing that the Mormon Church has a difficulty with right now is navigating the environment that they've created for themselves by saying we're the only true and living church, and yet we want to be friends with all of the Christian people who we for years and years told them that we're right and they're wrong. That is a hard line to walk right now, where it's trying to foster this relationship with evangelical Christianity in America, especially in the West, and build this allyship for kind of Christendom together. And yet the church has always said that it's the true one. It's said that God selected this one.
Yeah, and there's so many paradoxes trying to have both sides, that there's many great important things yet to be revealed. And also they know everything already. There's a sealed portion that's going to come, but like, what room is there for any new doctrine or anything? Because everything is so tightly dialed in. Or, you're loved unconditionally, but if you drink coffee, you're not going to have any internal progression. Like, it's a bunch of paradoxes there. The one thing that I thought about with the ego, I like that analogy, but I also think, I think Freud talked about how the ego's job is to minimize pain and suffering. And that's why it projects and it has all these defense mechanisms, like it's trying to keep things on the steady. And I think the biggest detriment to us from this idea that like the natural man is an enemy to God, this fallen state. I mean, on the one hand, Mormonism tried to walk away from that a bit in their kind of rewriting of the fall. Adam felt that men might be men, or that they might have joy, or like we're responsible for our own sins, not for Adam's transgressions. But yet, on the other hand, they still have, the natural man is an enemy of God. We're fallen. We need the atonement. So there is some confusion there. But I think, if you inherently believe that you are nothing, that you not on any merit of your own, like you're incomplete, you're fallen, that builds in, people's normal defense mechanism for that is to project, to focus on other people's faults, kind of the narcissistic traits. And not everybody, but, that's the way that we cope, is that we need to feel good about ourselves. And we do that through perfectionism, or we do that through projecting the things that we dislike most about ourselves onto other people. And so I think that this Judeo-Christian view of fallen man creates a hyperactive ego that's trying to, that needs to do a lot of things to avoid really feeling how we truly feel about ourselves, or we've been programmed to feel about ourselves.
In the project of being, this is the basis of all magic. You see, in a Christian context, magic is heresy because it implies that man can command God to act. In other words, that in some strange way, the magician compels nature to behave as the magician desires. In Hermeticism, it isn't so much put in terms of compel, but the idea is that humanity, human beings, men and women of great spiritual accomplishment are co-partners in the project of being, and that God, as it were, stepped off the stage of creation with it only 90% completed, and the rest is left in the hands of his brother. The Hermetica actually refers to humanity as the brother of God. So it's a completely different attitude toward being human. It's an empowering attitude. With power comes the potential to abuse power, because you're no longer a worm, You remember that image in Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he says you're like a worm suspended over an abyss, held there only by the love of a merciful God, implying that if he weren't a merciful God, he'd just let go of your thread and you'd go down the tubes. In the Hermetic magical view, human beings are not tainted by original sin. And no ideology is without the potential of abuse. The Hermetic attitude in the Renaissance was summed up in a single aphorism by the great Renaissance Platonist Marcello Ficino. And what he said was, and I have to, there's no sexism in all of this. You just have to realize these guys were primitive types and they hadn't confronted the political issues we've confronted. So when they say man, they mean humanity. The Renaissance magical attitude is summed up in Ficino's aphorism, man is the measure of all things. And this is a double-edged sword, because in a single affirmation, you cast off the guilt trip. You cast off the view of ourselves as a flawed creature. But when you say man is the measure of all things, you could be the chairman of the board of Louisiana Pacific or Dow Chemical. This is approximately their attitude. In other words, it ain't rainforests, it's not the life of the earth, it's none of that malarkey. We are to be the measure of all things. So it has to be tempered. We'll probably end up talking a bit here about about the pathological expression of the Hermetic position, which is called Faustianism. And Faustianism is where you have unbridled ego, unbridled faith in the intellect, so that you proceed forward without self-doubt.
We could take a second here. So I love what he's talking about, this other perspective of seeing humanity rather than as starting off on the wrong foot, being fallen, as being in partnership of creation with God. And it made me think of an article that I came across earlier in the week, which was called Biocentrism, a Scientific Answer to the Meaning of Life. And it was an excerpt from this book called The Dawn of a Mindful Universe by Marcelo Gleiser. I haven't read this book, and I don't really know Marcelo Gleiser, but I wanted to share that title in case anybody wanted to read this, because I feel like it was really effective at kind of pointing out this fatal flaw, or hopefully not a fatal flaw, but just when we've put humanity as the center, or at the very top rather, of this important hierarchy, which is what kind of happened in the garden when you think about God calling humans the giving them dominion over the earth. The Lord gives Adam and Eve dominion over all things, which I guess you could have responsible dominion, but what it appears what we've done with consciousness is put the planet on a serious harmful trajectory. And this biocentrism idea, it posits that life is so unique that it is fully sacred. It's effectively all sacred in its uniqueness. It's something where we're a part of it. We're part of the entire loop and all of the system of Earth. And that's where ethics and moral judgment should start, is as, thinking of life as a whole, and humans as being a part of that whole, not as kind of the prize of it all.
Yep. This may not sound related, but this is what I was thinking about. It's interesting. on the one end, the one end of the spectrum is, this exalting a deity above us. But then, there's this other end of the spectrum. And so I'm writing this piece on entropy, but I talk a bit about science and like the shift in the scientific revolution. And one thing that came to me as I was writing it, I'll just read this paragraph. So I'm talking about how, we shifted from religion and dogma, and our reaction to it was so, we went to the polar opposite and have removed ourselves as observers from the observed, and have this overemphasis on subject object and objective systems that we can study as though we are not there. So this paragraph says, the fact that the observer is part of the system being observed is a concept science has managed to ignore for some time, though it hasn't always been this way. With the scientific revolution, we attempted to remove religious deities and related dogma from science through emphasis on objectivity and detachment. Yet in doing so, we unwittingly deified man to a position above and separate from the things he is observing. So it's funny, scientific materialist, people atheists that don't believe in a higher power or anything, instead swing to a side where everything has meaning from just the meaning that it has to us as humans, and yet we don't view ourselves as part of the system. This is the difficulty in quantum physics of things don't make sense because we think we can observe objective systems without the observer having any effect on it, or how we observe it and how we measure things. But the other things that he was saying, very similar to, the emphasis in Mormonism on us being brothers of Christ, or like in the temple ceremony, it's like, we're co-creators. Jesus and Michael go down to create the world. So there's a lot of things that, a lot of overlap similarities between Mormonism and Hermeticism. I think the other thing on this idea of being fallen that comes up is I see people really just despairing over people leaving religion and how there's just going to be this moral decay of society. I saw somebody post the other day, one of my friends on Facebook, something about how, is one of these conservative think tanks or universities or something, and the professor was just talking about how basically religion has kept society together. Like that's where we get our morals, is this belief in God, which to people that are religious like that often is how it's presented, is like, God is the only thing keeping us moral because, the natural man is an enemy of God. I was listening to the Tao Te Ching the other day. Have you ever listened to the Tao Te Ching?
I've got a copy of it. I've read
it.
Some of it.
So it's 500 BC, Lao Tzu. It's, to my understanding, essentially, I was just eating dinner yesterday with a Chinese American friend, and she doesn't consider it. She's like, it's not spiritual. I think she was equating that with religious, but I'd say it's a spiritual text. But it's like the kind of underpinnings of, I think, Chinese society. She's like, everybody just like that. That's how we live. Although she says people don't necessarily believe it that seriously. But I got something queued up that I really liked that spoke to this. Let me see if I can play it real quick.
When the greatness of the Tao is present, action arises from one's own heart. When the greatness of the Tao is absent, action comes from the rules of kindness and justice. If you need rules to be kind and just, if you act virtuous, this is a sure sign that virtue is absent. Thus we see the great hypocrisy When kinship falls into discord, piety and rites of devotion arise. When the country falls into chaos, official loyalists will appear and patriotism is born.
So I just, I like how it kind of emphasized that. So the Tao is essentially like life force energy, chi, whatever. It's like the force of nature, and like that is actually what causes us to be kind, and rules of like justice and kindness actually complicate things, but it's our inherent nature to do that. And I think and that was a concern of mine, when I left the church, is like, I often thought in the church, if I wasn't in the church, I would just be, ruining my life this way and not faithful and addicted to these things and whatnot. And then I left the church. I was like, oh, I guess I'm just a good person because I want to be kind to people and connect with people. And, it wasn't actually the church that was keeping me on the straight and narrow. But
I do think about religion and Christianity's place in the story of Western culture, and I think of it as an evolutionary process, not unlike how we evolved, a spinal cord or some kind of hearing system or some other kind of antenna system or something, where it became such a ubiquitous thing with when Christianity got married up with government power, that it became so much a part of our history as humans now, that it's like what Terence was saying, it's in the airs, it's in our laws, it's in our constitutional arrangements for government. It is ingrained in us, and it will remain ingrained in us. And what I think what can happen is that over time, it's like the Christianity has to be evolving to capture that spirituality. For religion to have spirituality, it's got to be doing something to believers, to provide it. And I think that what you shared from the Tao Te Ching makes a lot of sense with that, because when you've got to act out the spirituality, that's when you've lost it. I think like the Pharisees and the Sadducees were the ones who were supposed to be the most spiritual among the social structure, and yet they were the ones that Jesus was pretty, was ridiculing as hypocrites. And I think there's, it's, no one wants to think that their prophet or their leader or their guy is the equivalent to a Pharisee or a Sadducee. I think Christ was just saying that it, like, thematically, the spirituality isn't going to be found there for the sake of there, that it's it can be through those things, but it's out there.
I think it's a know better, do better thing, and it's it's the way we evolve is we make models, and we start with simplified models, dichotomies, and so this good and evil, God and Satan. Yes, it has some utility. It's just like parenting too. You can get your kids to do what you want them to do by punishment and reward. But as I got into nonviolent communication, like he's very much against punishment or reward, because which sounds kind of bizarre. But he asked Marshall Rosenberg, the guy that created it, was like, what do you want people to do? The first question is like, what do you want people to do? Like, oh, I want this person to do this. And then it's like, why do you want them to do it? And that's the problem. Is it like, yeah, I want my kid to be nice to this other person, but I actually want them to be nice to, their sibling because they want to, not because they worry that they're going to get punished by me. And so sometimes you have to do that, and, you don't have the bandwidth, or you can't do any better. But then when you can, you evolve, and then you learn how to parent better, and you're trying to instill values, and so I think there's an evolution past religion where you're not doing. And some people within Mormonism, I think, are able to do this. They don't really care much about the rules. They just kind of naturally do what's right to them, and it maybe doesn't always line up with what the church says. But many other people, it's very difficult to not take things seriously that are in the church guidelines.
Or just maybe hold a much less literal view of it all, because when it isn't literal, it can become as effective as any other model for for guidance, inspiration.
Teach people correct principles, right? Let them govern themselves.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we'll keep Terence going.
If you haven't read Faust recently, it's a surprising read. First of all, it's very funny. It's hilarious. It's funnier than any of Shakespeare's plays, I think. And the way it ends is the guy dedicates himself to land reclamation and the draining of swamps to build low-cost housing for poor people. I mean, people don't know this. They're caught up in the images of the center of the story where, magical power is running rampant. But Faust's final conclusion is that he should do some good work for the least of society and give up these Promethean and Titanic dreams of the mastery of power. Well, a little bit of history about this Hermetic ideal. It's an interesting story in the light of our discussion of time yesterday. Western civilization, in a way, can be thought of as an accumulated series of misunderstandings. And one of the most severe of these misunderstandings has to do with this whole business of Hermeticism. The Renaissance really believed that Hermes Trismegistus was a great teacher of antiquity who preceded Moses, who was in time older than Moses. And they had what they called the Prisci Theologica, the three theologians, and they were Hermes Trismegistus, Moses, and Orpheus, in that order. And the reason that I say Western civilization is built on a series of misunderstandings is because they got it all wrong about Hermes Trismegistus, and there was great confusion and unhappiness in the 16th century when Marie Casaubon, who was an early philologist, attacked the dating of the Hermetic corpus and argued correctly that this could not possibly have been written in a period preceding Moses, that in fact this was post-Christian, written no earlier than the 1st century A.D. This is the equivalent of us finding out that, George Washington was alive in Greenwich Village in the 1930s or something. I mean, it was a completely mind-bending realignment of how people thought the history of the world had unfolded, because they had up to that time thought that when you studied Hermes Trismegistus, you were reading the oldest philosopher in human history. Actually, it's very late. And in a way, this is what destroyed the magical alternative. The advent of modern philology showed that these so-called ancient texts were not ancient at all. They were late Roman. They were Hellenistic. And so strongly was imprinted in the Western mind, what's called, and we've talked about it here this weekend, what's called the nostalgia for paradise. In other words, the belief that the older it is, the better it is. And Giambattista Vico in La Ciencia Nuova laid the basis for this kind of thinking. It's called classicism in the Renaissance context. So once they found out that the Hermetic corpus had been written in late Roman times, it was like it was finished. And science was able to use the confusion in the magical community at that point to force its own agenda very strongly. And there have been numerous episodes of misplaced dating like this that have contributed to the confusion around the history of magic. For example, and I hope this doesn't bring somebody rising out of their chair in an air-clawing rave, but Rosicrucianism rests on a whole bunch of phony dates because they want to tell you that somebody named Christian Rosencrantz wrote a book called The Chemical Wedding and sealed it up in a time capsule in the 12th century, and that it was then dug up in the 16th, dug up in the 16th century. But actually all these Rosicrucian documents were ponied up by people in the 16th century who had a very complicated political agenda, which we will probably discuss as part of this weekend. Hermetic philosophy is based on what is called the Hermetic corpus. This is a group of books, the most important of which is called the Asclepius. And these books, most of them, were completely lost during the Middle Ages. At the fall of the Roman Empire, copies of these Hermetic manuscripts were systematically destroyed by enthusiastic Christian barbarians. And the Hermetic manuscripts were scattered, and they only survived then in monasteries in Syria and places like that. Well, then in the Renaissance, the Council of Florence, under the patronage of the Borgias and people like that, they became there was this great interest suddenly in antiquities, because these Roman statuary and stuff was coming out of the ground. So the Council of Florence commissioned a character named Gemistus Pletho to go to Syria and bring back these manuscripts. And they established a translation commission. And they had, in manuscript, the works of Plato, the works of Hermes Trismegistus, a whole bunch of ancient literature. And to show you what the psychology of the Renaissance was, here they had Plato, which they hadn't been able to read for 1,000 years, sitting there waiting for translation, and Cosimo de' Medici said to Marcello Ficino, Plato can wait. Translate the Hermetic corpus first. And so it was done. If you're interested in Renaissance Hermeticism, you can't do better than read Dame Frances Yates' book, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition. Well, I want to read you some of this stuff because it's very interesting, and it has a modernity that is astonishing. It's also very psychedelic. Here's a little passage on...
Just want to shout out to a book, actually, that I was thinking about as he was talking about this. It's called The House of Wisdom, How Arabic Science Saved Ancient Knowledge and Gave Us the Renaissance, by Jim Al-Khalili. And this book I read a couple of years ago, but it's really fascinating. It's about the way that Arab scholars basically had found all of the writings, so many writings from Western philosophers, ancient Greek, Hellenistic philosophers, and had been translating them into Arabic in these houses, these Enlightenment houses, and basically preserved Western philosophy when the library in Egypt, that huge library that was burned down in Egypt, and where so much of the Western writings of Western philosophers and ideas throughout time had been lost, basically picked it up where the Arabs had been, where people had been translating it into Arabic and other languages, all of those writings. So that's a really cool book, The House of Wisdom. There's probably a lot of other books about the same topic, but one that I thought was pretty accessible and just gave a good synopsis of it.
On the imagination. I'm reading from Book 9 of the Corpus Hermeticum in the Scott translation. This is a 4-volume set. I only brought the text and translation volume, but if you read Greek, it's all here. If you don't, it's all here in English. But this will just give you a feeling for the approach. If then you do not make yourself equal to God, you cannot apprehend God, for like is known by like. Leap clear of all that is corporeal, and make yourself to a like expanse with that greatness which is beyond all measure.
Like is known by like. That smacks of Moroni chapter 7, where verse 48, where Jesus Christ, that you may become the sons of God, that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. That you may have this hope, that we may be purified even as he is pure. Which is, what if Joseph Smith came across those very much that like for like idea in Hermetic writing?
Yeah, it's funny that, when in early Mormonism, the magic and the occult were not bizarre, because people were using astrology and having Shew-Stones and using dowsing rods and whatnot. But then in late 1800s, early 1900s, that was whitewashed. But then when it came back around, I think with Mike Quinn's book, the church had to acknowledge it, but it's just presented as like, oh, this is their culture back then. Everybody believed this. It's where he started, but he quickly did away with that. If you actually understand alchemy and magic and Hermeticism, like, this is where the gods in Embryo and that we're divine, like, that's where it comes from.
Totally.
So
rise above all time and become eternal, then you will apprehend God. Think that for you too nothing is impossible. Deem that you too are immortal, and that you are able to grasp all things in your thought, to know every craft and every science. Find your home in the haunts of every living creature. Make yourself higher than all heights and lower than all depths.
Joseph Smith say something about that, I think in Richmond, Liberty Jail. One of them is saying, basically saying, to become like God, we need to rise above all things and descend below all things. And so,
bring together in yourself all opposites of quality, heat and cold, dryness and fluidity. Think that you are everywhere at once, on land, at sea, in heaven. Think that you are not yet begotten, that you are in the womb, that you are young, that you are old, that you have died, that you are in the world beyond the grave. Grasp in your thought all this at once, all times and places, all substances and qualities and magnitudes together. Then you can apprehend God. But if you shut up your soul in your body and abase yourself and say, I know nothing, I can do nothing, I am afraid of earth and sea, I cannot mount to heaven, I know not what I was, nor what I shall be, then what have you to do with God? Your thought can grasp in good if you cleave to the body and are evil. Interesting.
So another interesting thing that made me think of, I was watching Word Radio the other day. They were talking about, I think it was their debunking Freemasonry, Shew-Stones thing, which they actually didn't debunk Freemasonry. But they were getting really jazzed about like Enoch and Moses's vision and stuff, and just talking about like, yeah, you know, they saw everything, you know, from the beginning of time, end of time. And it's interesting because my brother years ago, I remember him telling me like, oh yeah, you know, all the prophets, they basically get the same vision where they just see everything. And that has taken on new meaning, you know, as I've learned about, you know, the mystical experience or the attributes of, you know, the prototypical mystical experiences. Like, oh yeah, this is like, if you know anything about research into psychedelics or mystical experiences, whether psychedelic or religious, like this is the hood mysticism scale right there, is talking about those things. And that's, you know, very much overlaps with what, you know, Moses experienced in the book of Moses. And you know, when you read again, I think in the book of Moses about how Moses needed to be transfigured because you can't be in the presence of God and see. Yeah, you can't be in the presence of God without being transfigured. I was like, this is. There's just people trying to describe a mystical state of consciousness and how it is in a different plane of reality than this plane of reality. But they, you know, they're so close, but they're just viewing it within the perspective of Mormonism or Christianity, and not looking, or even, you know, it's bizarre or heretical to try to draw any comparison with psychedelics, or that other people from other religions have the same experience.
Right. And I think this this thing that Terence was reading about, basically seeing it all as one whole, is the way to apprehend God. Because I think anything less is limits what God is. And God is the best word for whatever it is we're talking about. So it's seeing it all as the interconnectedness. I think Joseph Smith even probably was much more in line with describing it in those words. I mean, John 17, I think we've talked about on this show before. John 17 is the intercessory prayer where Jesus Christ is praying to the Father, and he's praying that they will all be one, that we could just all be one. Can't we all just be one? And that chapter has whole new meaning after, you know, seeing other perspectives.
I mean, as mistranslated and not contemporary as the book or the Bible is, it still has a lot of stuff like all there, you know, like Christ saying, like, doesn't your own scripture say, like, ye are gods? And Sermon on the Mount being like, you know, just be in the moment, be mindful, don't think about tomorrow, you know, the loaves of the field. Love God, love your neighbor, because they're actually the same thing. It's all there.
Yeah, so I think it's what we're talking about, like where religion, when it does have the spirituality, it does propel humankind forward. But then it's the absence, when the spirituality moves outside of the building and it's in the outdoors, then it's society at large that moves forward in the advancement. And then the religion has to evolve and catch back up, and then it gets infused again with the spirit, which pulls people. It's like this inchworm movement.
Yeah, it's just the nature of, if you're living in a two-dimensional society and you access the third dimension, you can come back and you might be able to give a pretty good description to a two-dimensional person, even though it'd be difficult. And maybe that person might be able to grasp it a little bit. But if they try to tell another two-dimensional person, there's only one degree of separation, and then it's like lost, like some severe telephone.
Well, this is why I love LSD in the Mind of the Universe, Chris Bache and his own journey into the deepest, the I guess, revealing the truest form of reality in his methodical way, because the duality exists all the way up even through archetypal reality, where you at the collective level, and he I think what he experienced by going deep into beyond, outside of himself and beyond the collective conscious into the light, as he described it, is it's like the same thing that Jesus Christ did in the Garden of Gethsemane. I know people personally who've had experiences where they share how similar what they went through in a psychedelic or a mystical state of consciousness, how they experienced what is described as what Jesus Christ is said to have experienced in the garden. And I think other people have been there. It's like you said, it's as soon as they turn around from parting the curtain and seeing the light, then it's filtered through their bias, through their culture, through their amalgamation of language and concepts that are, refracting through them, the light refracting through them, and then somebody else interprets it and it goes through them. And yeah, religions try really hard to keep the light contained in the bottle there, but it always escapes out eventually, and then it's got to be found again, and it's found on the outskirts of consciousness, and because it's in the growth zone, it's never in the comfort zone, and it's found where the heart and the mind are both engaged and are vibrating at in harmony towards something. That's my experience anyway.
Yeah, I mean, this is why Joseph Smith, as well as many other people, knew there needed to be a restoration. Why none of the churches on the earth were true, and ironically, it's the process that the church has gone through since Joseph Smith.
It's all there. Again. It's all there is. It's
very quickly. I mean, with Brigham Young.
Ouroboros. It's the snake shedding its skin. It's the seasons.
Yeah, and that's not to say that I don't think that Joseph Smith did restore. I mean, integrate some things, but very quickly it went from mystical and esoteric to back down to into a
so literal.
organization. So if for anybody that doesn't know, you're mentioning Christopher Bache's book, LSD, The Mind of the Universe, and he was a religion and philosophy professor that decided to scientifically, experientially explore, map out philosophy, what reality is, by doing 70 plus high dose LSD sessions following Stan Grof's protocols, very methodical, over I think a couple decades. And yeah, I mean, when I read those sessions that he was going through, atonement, Gethsemane things, it was very, very Gethsemane vibe, more so I think than actually I ever felt about Christ and the story of the Garden of Gethsemane. And I never really I don't think I ever really connected or felt to. I mean, half the time it's like the way the church teaches it, you feel bad because you're causing like those drops of blood or whatnot. But reading Chris Bache's book and seeing that like he was doing this for society to like as a shaman, and seeing like this, just the depths of hell that he was going through, and then for in the name of science and philosophy and public knowledge, and then he would also have the high, the blissful heaven afterwards. But yeah, it felt very, very spiritual hearing it, reading it. All right, we'll keep playing.
Very different from the humble yourself, hard labor, spun wool and watery beer approach of medieval Christianity. Here's an amazing passage. People like to think people thought the world was flat until the Renaissance. This is an incredible psychedelic image of outer space that is 2nd century AD. Would that it were possible for you to grow wings and soar into the air. Poised between earth and heaven, you might see the solid earth, the fluid sea and the streaming rivers, the wandering air, the penetrating fire, the courses of the stars, and the swiftness of the movement with which heaven encompasses all. What happiness were that, my son, to see all these borne along with one impulse, and to behold him who is unmoved, moving in all that moves, and him who is hidden, made manifest through his works. And it goes on and on. It's very readable. It's very literary. It's highly poetic. It's a celebration of nature. The notion of sin is completely absent, and it rings with a kind of confidence, a kind of joy that was completely running counter to the brimstone and damnation point of view of Christianity. Here's to me, a psychedelic passage. But he who presents all things to us through our senses, and thereby manifests himself through all things and in all things, and especially to those to whom he wills to manifest himself. Begin then, my son Tat, with a prayer to the Lord and Father, who alone is good. Pray that you may find favor with him, and that one ray of him, if only one, may flash into your mind, so that you may have power to grasp in thought that mighty being. For thought alone can see that which is hidden, inasmuch as thought itself is hidden from sight. And if even the thought which is within you is hidden from your sight, how can he, being in himself, be manifest to you through your bodily eyes? But if you have power to see with the eyes of the mind, then, my son, he will manifest himself to you. For the Lord manifests himself ungrudgingly through all the universe, and you can behold God's image with your eyes and lay hold on it with your hands. If you wish to see him, think on the sun, think on the course of the moon, think on the order of the stars. Who is it that maintains that order? The sun is the greatest of the gods in heaven. To him as to their king and overlord, and all the kings of heaven yield place. And yet this mighty God, greater than earth and sea, submits to having smaller stars circling above him. Who is it then, my son, that he always obeys with reverence and awe? Each of these stars, too, is confined by measured limits and has an appointed space to range in. Why do not all the stars in heaven run like and equal courses? Who is it that is assigned to each its place, and marked out for each the extent of its course, and so forth?
Sounds almost exactly like the Book of Abraham and describing Kolob and the orders of stars and time and greater stars and lesser stars.
Yeah, and also the seeing God, and even some of that verbiage right there. I was trying to find where that was. I was looking in D&C 93, but there's probably other places where it's even more.
The concept of the second comforter,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what it's all about. It's like, if you are, righteous enough, you'll see Christ. You'll see Christ's face. The first comforter is the Spirit. The second comforter is Christ. And
have you ever read the book or seen the movie Silence? It's a Japanese author who wrote the original book, and then, gosh, I should know his name, but then it was made as a film a couple of years back. But it's about these Christian European missionaries who traveled to Japan, and Japan was particularly, a lot of the warlords in Japan were particularly brutal to Christians. They didn't want Christianity to get a foothold in Japan, and these missionaries undergo this basically intense suffering to avoid having to step on this picture of Christ and renounce their faith. And that's what the Japanese, like the warlord guys, the people that are in control there, want them to do. Really good book, and it puts an interesting perspective on the whole way that Jesus Christ, it especially in the intro of the book, the I think it's the foreword of the book, talks about how Judas was commanded by Jesus to betray him. It was almost like he just did exactly what he was supposed to do. He was one of the 12 who was going to betray Christ, and Christ would still even choose one of them to do that. It's like representing the 12 apostles are this spectrum of all of the possibilities of belief, even to the Judas who is a betrayer and isn't a believer. And Jesus selects all of them. Kind of he's the wholeness. It was represented across them. Like each, we can see ourselves in somewhere along that spectrum of the fully believing and faithful jumping out of the boat, Peter, to the Judas who's the betrayer. And yeah, I think Silence did some interesting things for me when I was reading that, just to think about what that relationship could mean outside of normal Christianity or Mormonism. So that's another book.
Yeah, one thing that it was interesting that he was talking about how sin just doesn't make an appearance in these Hermetic teachings. It made me think of, there's a post on the Mormonism and Western Esotericism Facebook group the other day. Somebody said, great take on the concept of damnation. Frederick Farrar felt compelled to correct teachings about damnation and hell. He strongly proclaimed what he termed, quote, simple, undeniable, and indisputable facts. The verb to damn and its cognates does not occur once in the Old Testament. No word conveying any such meaning occurs in the Greek in the New Testament, end quote. He goes on to explain that the word damnation is a grievous mistranslation and perverts and obscures the real meaning of our Lord's utterances. Farrar also points out the overwhelming demonstration of a loving Father in heaven throughout the Bible as additional evidence that the definitions of hell and damnation used in the English translation were incorrect. And then they reference Quentin L. Cook. So I don't know if this was from like the Liahona or what, where he's getting it, but it's interesting because it's like, yeah, that's good, but I don't think we stop there. Like, I think the idea of sin and evil, like when you recognize everything's one, you don't need a hell. You don't need a place to banish people to. And in fact, you realize that's impossible because it's all connected. Eternity. So you can't. It's just like in personal therapy, is nobody heals by repressing a part of themselves more or feeling more shame. Yeah. And my response to that post was, I said something along the lines of I said, I like that, but in my opinion, this doesn't stop at damnation. This integration needs to extend to sin, Satan, and the whole philosophical dualism between good and evil. I think leaving the 99 in search of the one is really a story of integration and shadow work. But again, you don't, if you suggest to somebody that there isn't evil, or maybe better yet, that evil is just the forgetting of oneness, the forgetting that we're all brothers and sisters in Christ. We're all we're all one mind manifesting itself. People need evil, because then they can have the concept of good, and then they can feel good, and they need other people to be evil, or to do things wrong, because then they can feel like, well, at least I don't, I didn't do that. I did that before. That's what, it's like a core trait of narcissism is like you put everybody else down, you project things. You need other people to have faults so that you can feel better about yourself, because inherently you feel so crappy about yourself. But
so it's a nature-oriented, celebratory. It glories in the exercise of the mind. It is not doctrinal. It is not pietistic. It is magical, psychedelic, expansive. And I'm not implying that they used psychedelic substances. The evidence for that is incredibly murky and hard to get at, and probably they didn't. I mean, one of the real tragedies of Western history is that Western Europe is so poor in psychoactive plants.
Yeah, he mentions that the Hermetic philosophers may not have used psychedelics, and I think it's worth mentioning again, which we have in other episodes of this show, that the method of achieving a mystical state of consciousness is less important than the state itself. There's a lot of ways to get there. You've described it as a mountaintop, a lot of paths to get to the top of the mountain, of being in a different state of consciousness to receive different, I would say, different qubits of truth, let's just say, but that it can happen through breath work. It can happen through meditative states. It can happen through fasting. It can happen through ecstatic dance. It can happen through just a Kundalini awakening, a random season of life where things fluctuate. And that psychedelics, which we talk about on the show from time to time, that's one method, but it's not required or mandatory. Or in my view, it's never something that like is the solution or the way or the path. That's just one way to get to the top of this mountain.
Yeah, I like that you said that, and that he said that too, because I think that's my complaint about the emphasis on the emphasis on psychedelics in early Mormonism, is that I think it's very likely for the group things, but like Joseph Smith's own experiences, I don't know, it doesn't really make any difference one way or the other. And the more you paint yourself into a corner that it needs to be this or it needs to be that modality, it is easier to dismiss and to be wrong, because you might be wrong about the modality. And it also obscures the scientific evidence and data that shows that that it is a state. I've described it as like there's the destination and then there's the mode of transport. So it's like it is New York City. And although most people, if you go to New York City, most everybody visiting there will have gone there by plane. So most people equate the two, but they start to conflate it. And if you've only ever gone to New York City, then you start to, you find out you're going on a plane tomorrow. You're like, I love going on a plane because I love seeing the Empire State Building. But that's not necessarily where you're going to go. Or if you're there and you assume that everybody else there got there the same way, it conflates things, and it doesn't do justice to really what the evidence shows. And I think when you don't, and I think it also I think that's so key to understand that there's a mystical experience with many different modalities, because once you accept that, and maybe why people don't accept that is because it shatters a lot of paradigms. There's a bunch of people that had mystical experiences through religious experiences that they worked very hard at through their piety and their
Game Shark
ascetic lifestyle or whatnot. And then somebody else goes and takes mushrooms and they have the same or like a more powerful experience. It's kind of like a slap in their face. And so, offensive in some ways. And that's why people, that some people feel like, the only way to get there is meditating, and you may be meditating for years and years, and think that another way is a shortcut. But it's important to making a meta framework of everything and integrating things to recognize that, because otherwise you can have mystical experiences but stay really stuck in either materialism because they're like, it's just the substances that are in my brain and creating neurotransmitters that are somehow magically creating experience, where you can be very stuck in religion because it's, you got it because you prayed and you did all these right things, but all those other people that are saying they got the same experience, no, that's Satan doing it, because your Bible doesn't say anything about those substances, and so it must be Satan.
I'm more comfortable saying that what seems to be true is that people can experience spiritual realities that guide their life, that allow them to assign meaning for things, that allow them to move forward, that they can build a cultural framework to face the challenges of life with. That seems more true than to say that one of those experiences this really happened and the other ones are not what they say they are, or the other ones are some secondary or tertiary culture that's just going to be subsumed ultimately into this one worldview that is seemingly the most accurate. I just think that's so much less likely than just the diversity of experience tells me that humans go through this.
And this is at the core, I think, of this divide between apologists and anti, people in the church, and people, a lot of people that leave, they either didn't have many spiritual experiences, like I didn't have many spiritual experiences in church, or at least the ones they do, they just find an alternate explanation, and maybe that's like, maybe that's easy for them to do. I think it's much more uncommon for somebody to leave and be like, well, I still had that crazy experience. And I don't know how to explain that, but I'm leaving because these things don't line up. But the people that leave and have found an alternate explanation just because they didn't have powerful experiences that they feel are inexplicable in the church doesn't mean that the people that stay in the church haven't, because some people are very, not susceptible, but very more able to have these experiences. And there's plenty of people in the church that are like, no, I know that I heard this still small voice that told me to turn left here, and then a car. Some people have very powerful spiritual experiences in the church, and so their mind is blown as to, these anti-people must just be, they must still know, but they are, people, there's no validation of the realness of people's experiences because the main narratives don't leave any space for it.
Well, there is, yeah, it's like, we'd love for you to learn about the secular history of the world through BYU, where we can put constraints on the, where we can make sure it's being filtered through the lens of the narrative. And I'm speaking as if I have experience. I never went to BYU. I graduated from a different school, but and maybe that's not a good example. We're primed in the religion of Mormonism, those of us who grew up in it or spent a significant amount of time in it, we're primed to have the experiences that we have and to allow them to have the meaning that we believe they're going to have once we have them. And so what's for me, I having stopped engaging the church in the same way that I did for many, many years and changing that, which involves not attending on Sunday. But for me, that means I'm still having spiritual experiences. I had spiritual experiences while I was in the church. I continue to have spiritual experiences. Am I having counterfeit spiritual experiences? Have they just always been inside of me anyway?
Yeah. I mean, ironically for me, I didn't really have spiritual experiences in the church. Really, when I left, it wasn't until I thought I was becoming an atheist, because I'm like, well, I'm just going to follow Sam Harris and start this meditation. Like at that point, when I walked away from everything, then I was like, oh, this is interesting. So yeah, that doesn't add up with Moroni's promise. All right, let's keep going with Terence.
I mean, had Western Europe stayed in touch with the mystery religions of ancient Greece, Christianity would never have been able to force its agenda to the degree that it did. I think you can make an argument that there were psychedelic mysteries in Europe, probably up until the time of the fall of Eleusis. Hermeticism is only one heterodox strain among many that were in existence in Europe in the late Roman period, and that then partially survived into the Dark Ages. I mean, you have Neoplatonism, which is a group of philosophers in the 3rd and 4th century who Plotinus, Porphyry, Proclus, and that crowd, and they took Plato, the late Plato, and contorted that into a mystical doctrine of emanation. They were what are called emanationists. What this means is you start with, it's either called the One or the Unnameable or Brahman, Atman, or something like that, and then you have a series of declensions into more and more material and more multiplistic expressions of being. These Neoplatonists were emanationists, and their theories about how the universe is constructed have become sort of the unconscious basis of all later magical speculation. They are the people who brought the angels into the picture so intensely, because they were trying to create a descending hierarchy of being from the most high down to the most low. And angels, once set in place, became a real problem for Christianity, because they are not very easy to distinguish from the old stellar demons of paganism. Paganism was largely the belief that the power of the stars could be drawn down to earth through sympathetic magic, really, by setting up resonances in a ritual situation. You could draw the power of the stars down into your projects and your intentions. And the late Middle Ages was a period of intensely working out all the associations between minerals, colors, perfumes, plants, musical notes, and styles, so that you could then bring together all these things for purposes of magical evocation. And if any of you are interested in this, the book to read, which will point you toward many other interesting books, is a wonderful book called Spiritual and Demonic Magic from Ficino to Campanella. Some of you may remember Campanella, hell of a fighter. Anyway, hello? And in the Renaissance, over a period of about 3 generations, this became a real problem, because what starts out as angel magic ends up as out-and-out demonic conjuration. Something which I've noticed my 14-year-old son has an incredibly unhealthy interest in, which I did as well at his age. I hope it's not the family curse coming back. So I mentioned the dating error. It was Lactantius, was one of the fathers of the early church, one of the patristic writers. That's that generation of theologians that followed Christ, who canonized the Christian religion. And he placed Hermes Trismegistus as older than Moses, older than Pythagoras, older than Plato. And then it wasn't until Marie Casaubon corrected that problem. See, we forget how the really transformative breakthrough that was represented for Western Europe by the recovery of all of this ancient literature. It had been completely lost. And also a misimpression that probably needs correcting is, I think most people who are not schooled in Western history think that the further back in time, the more quote-unquote superstitious people were. This isn't actually the case. It isn't a case of the further back in time you go, the more belief in demons, magical conjuration, and stuff like that you get. The 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries in Europe were periods of remarkable piety and intellectual cohesion. Of course, it was also some kind of a fascist nightmare. That's how they achieved it. They had stamped out paganism. They had pushed heresy and heterodox thinking to the very distant frontiers of the empire, of the Holy Roman Empire. And people were not superstitious, and people were not obsessed with horoscopes and conjuration and this sort of thing. Where that all began was, where it reached its culmination is in the 16th century. The 16th century, the 1500s, it was the most magical, obsessed century in the last 10. And alchemy and conjuration and talismanic magic and sympathetic magic, all of these things flourished really not as a throwback, but as a kind of prelude to modern science. modern science is an incredibly demonic enterprise. And we will see, as we discuss this stuff, that in a curious and rarely discussed way, the program, the agenda of magical dissidents in Europe have been entirely achieved by the forces of what we call modernity. It's simply that it has been done in an entirely secular metaphor. I mean, if you take even the trivial belief about alchemists, that they were concerned with changing lead into gold. Of course, that isn't what it was about, but there were plenty of con artists running around on the periphery of these deeper scenes who were claiming they could change lead into gold. Well, in the 20th century, we routinely change lead to gold. You do it with neutron bombardment in particle accelerators. And of course, it costs far more to do it than the worth of the gold that you get out. But that really wasn't the point, was it? It was to prove that it could be done. The dreams of creating the homunculus are dreams that dovetail directly into the aspirations of modern biology, genetics, so forth and so on. The great chain of being of Aristotle is animated, given a dimension of motion, and lo and behold, it becomes the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution. Merciliade talks about this, about how all the alchemical dreams of the 15th and 16th century have been brought to fruition in the 20th century, but again, in the absence of magical rhetoric, but certainly in a spirit of magical and Faustian recklessness, for sure. I mean, this is scientists, they claim such a devotion to truth that decency must never stand in the way because they serve a higher God than human values. They serve the golem of the truth in some weird way that makes the truth okay even if it kills you. I studied philosophy from Paul Feyerabend, and he used to say at the beginning of his Epistemology 101 course, I will teach you to recognize the truth, and I will teach you to ask the question, what's so great about it? So now you've got the truth, so what's so great about it? It was 1460 when these manuscripts were brought to Florence. Those of you with photographic memories can see the time wave signature as it turns over and heads through the floor. Cosimo de' Medici immediately ordered Ficino to abandon his work on Plato, and the Pymander, which was one of these books, it was the only one which existed in Europe, even in partial form during the Dark Ages. Cosimo died in 1464, but the translation project went forward, and just so you understand, the developmental process in Western magic goes back to this Florentine translation project. And from there, people who were well-placed got a hold of this stuff. The most important person probably being a person, certainly an unsung hero in the development of Western thought, Trithemius, Bishop of Sponheim. And Trithemius wrote a book. It was really a manuscript. It was never printed as a book in his lifetime, but later, called the Stenographica. And in it, he put forth many of these magical doctrines and also encryption methods for code making and breaking so that this stuff could be circulated under the eyes of the clergy without causing a problem. And then the development of Western magic splits into two strains. The Bruno strain, Giordano Bruno, I understand he's running for President of the United States this year. Giordano Bruno and his school, he was a Franciscan monk who ended up being burned at the stake. His sin for which he was burned at the stake was he was sitting on a rooftop of one of these Italian city-states one evening, presumably smoking some pretty decent boo that they'd brought in from North Africa. And he was looking at the stars, and it occurred to him, these things are suns. These little points of light are like the sun. Jesus Christ! And in a single moment, the universe became infinite. And he said, if these are suns, and he just, his mind was boggled, literally. I mean, can you imagine inside the medieval worldview where they have these concentric shells of angels and demons and all this? Suddenly this guy gets it in a single moment, and he sees that the universe is infinite, and he begins to say so. And this is against Aristotle. And the church just goes nuts, and they drive him out of Italy, and he has a whole bunch of adventures in England and other places. Eventually he makes the mistake of coming back to a place in northern Italy where he's betrayed by his patron, and he's burned at the stake for a point of view which all of us take quite for granted. The other strain of magic coming down from Trithemius is the Dee strain. And it is a bit more accessible to people like ourselves because John Dee was an Englishman, and he wrote in English. And so you don't have to conquer 16th century Italian or late Latin in order to read him, although he wrote a lot in Latin as well. Dee is a very interesting character, worth spending some time on, because Dee is the last person to be able to unify into one worldview science and mathematics and magic and astrology all together. So he is the greatest magician of his age and the greatest scientist of his age. He designed the navigation instruments that Sir Francis Drake used to go around the Cape Horn and sail up the coast of California. He was an intelligence operative serving Queen Elizabeth on the European continent. He could cast the best horoscope in Europe, and that was his entree into these various royal families of these various capital cities of Europe. And then he was, making maps of battlements and of the deployment of wharf facilities and shipbuilding capacity and stuff like that, and sending it all back to Elizabeth in these codes that he had learned from Trithemius, not personally, but from the Stenographica. And Dee, a very strange incident happened, which was on a cold day in April at his house in Mortlake, which is on the outskirts of London. Now it's completely surrounded by modern London. I should say he had the largest library in England. He had 6,000 books. Sir Philip Sidney and the Queen would occasionally call upon him to shoot the bull. And he was a very learned man. So one day in April of 1582, he's working at his desk at his room in Mortlake, and he goes outside. There's some disturbance in the garden, and he goes outside. And his story, and we have only his story, is that an angel descended in a ball of light and gave him an object which is to this day on exhibit in the British Museum. If you ever have a chance, it's worth hunting it down. It's in the Renaissance Hall. and it's a piece of black polished obsidian, roughly about this big and about that thick and very highly polished. He called it the Shew-Stone, S-H-E-W. And what the deal was you could look into the Shew-Stone if you had the right talent, and it was a magical theater. There were gods and demons and female spirits and all kinds of things swirling around this thing. Well, for the next many years, the Shew-Stone was the major guiding force on Dee's life. And a guy came to him named Edward Kelley. And Edward Kelley, legend has it that he had no ears, which in England at that time meant that you had committed some infraction in the province and they had removed your ears. It was the mark of a con artist. So you couldn't fool anybody else. They took your ears off. So then if you met somebody with no ears and a big scheme, you knew to keep your wallet in your pocket. So this guy Kelley had an immense facility with this Shew-Stone. I mean, he could just sit down with it, and it is one of the most puzzling and undiscussed episodes in the evolution of Western thought. The straight people just say, whoa, this is a bunch of crap, this guy Kelley. First of all, Dee was married to a much younger woman named Ann Dee, and at one point in the 10 years or so that Dee and Kelley were together, the angels of the Shew-Stone gave very explicit instructions so this guy was a Sharpie for sure. However, it's very puzzling, because if he was a con artist, he must have been a con artist of immense cleverness, because often the way the Dee angels would work is they would deliver very, very long messages in Latin backwards. And Kelley would just dictate this stuff at a very rapid speed, and Dee would write it down, and then they would put away the Shew-Stone, and then they would very laboriously rewrite this stuff from back to front, and then there would be these long, coherent harangues about what they should be doing, about which courtly figures they should support with money, and who should be introduced to who. It was very political, Well, what kind of a polymathic talent was Edward Kelley, that he could invert whole pages of Latin and reel it off and then have it be reconstructed and make sense? Also, we know about this because Dee kept a diary over the years that this was all going on. It's one of the most astonishing books in all of English literature. And until the last 10 years, the 1658 edition was the only edition ever published. It's called A True and Faithful Relation, or in full, A True and Faithful Relation of what passed for many years between Dr. Dee and some spirits, with annotation by Maurice Casaubon, the guy who did the correct dating on the Hermetica. And it's very interesting reading. It's, as I say, one of the most puzzling incidents in the whole history of science.
So, yeah, that's interesting. It's funny because he's talking about, how people reconcile Dee, and, half the people just say, that's a bunch of crap. If you listen to Jeffrey R. Holland, or if you listen to Gordon B. Hinckley or Bruce M. McConkie, they all put down these dichotomies of like, this is the greatest thing, with Joseph Smith, it's the greatest thing since Christ, or the biggest fraud, Book of Mormon's from heaven, or it's from hell. Holland goes on just about like just how impossible it could have been. But this guy's dictating Latin backwards. I mean, so many similarities. It's funny.
It is. And for an angel to deliver something, that's one of the similarities that I find pretty interesting. An angel to deliver something, and it's a Shew-Stone. You can see images on Google. The polished obsidian. It looks kind of like a mirror, I guess, but it's a piece of solid obsidian, so it's black, but it's highly polished, so it's shiny, it's circular, and it was delivered by the hands of an angel in his garden.
Yeah, the wife thing, he didn't quite make it clear, but Wikipedia says Kelley claimed to have communication from the angelic visitors that Dee and Kelley should exchange wives in the interest of furthering their philosophical partnership. Dee initially objected to the arrangement, but was convinced by the insistent urging of the angel through Kelley. When informed of the angel's suggested arrangement, Jane Dee objected strenuously and, quote, fell a weeping and trembling for a quarter of an hour. But John convinced her it was God's will and that the men share everything. Jane and John and Edward Kelley and his wife, Joanna, soon signed an agreement that the physical relationships seem to have been consummated soon after.
There's a debate going on that I see in Mormonism right now where there's kind of like a rehashing of the polygamy stuff and Joseph Smith. And what's fascinating is when I see the tendency to try and keep the shelf intact and keep kind of the belief state makes you want to navigate, find a narrative where it wasn't about sex or something like that. But it's still, there's not a narrative that doesn't make the man, the main character, and the woman, someone who's got to be, as an object, needs to navigate this situation, whether there's sex or not, or whatever it is. There's just,
none of it
always comes to that
sense, because if there was no sex, then Emma wouldn't have been concerned, and it wouldn't have been so appalling to these people that were being, propositioned, and these people are just all, so distraught. And I read some account of somebody saying that they fasted and didn't sleep for days until they had this miraculous confirmation that it was true, which is funny because I read it and I was like, oh, it's a recipe to have a mystical experience. So, yeah, I mean, the Ord Radio just, came out with that episode a few days ago about how Joseph Smith, his pattern was marrying pregnant women in Nauvoo. And so it couldn't have been about sex because they say, people didn't have sex with pregnant women because they thought it was harmful back then, which they just throw that out there as a as though ever that there was a consensus on that, and that somebody who was motivated by sexual predatory behavior would follow the consensus belief. It's it's a complicated thing, but it's a
lot of assumptions.
In terms of these narratives, it's funny because I posted about this because I thought this was very fascinating. I'm just, I don't have any problem reconciling this because it all fits within our narrative of people can contact spirits, entities, whatever they, some people call it aliens, some people call it spirits, some people think it's the subconscious, whatever, it all fits in within idealism, and it doesn't need to be from a god or from a Satan. And for some people, it's just channeled into creative works. For other people, it's like intuitive, psychic, weird communication that's not explainable any other ways. For other people, it's scientific discoveries. So it feels so good actually to have a narrative that doesn't require any mental gymnastics to hear this. But I'm super curious as to like how other people reconcile this, both from a faithful perspective or from like a atheist skeptical perspective. Like, I think it's interesting because you don't hear this talked about much at all. And if it is, it's just very, very rarely discussed and just in passing. But I think it's because it's hard to reconcile in either paradigm. From the faithful paradigm, like, why is this guy a couple hundred years earlier using a seer stone and translating in things that, if Joseph Smith was dictating sentences of Latin backwards, you better believe that would be put forth as an evidence of the Book of Mormon's authenticity.
For sure.
And then, but on the other hand, like, I think from an atheist perspective, like, some people could say like, oh, Joseph Smith was just copying this guy, 300 years prior, 200 some years prior. But then you'd have to confront, well, how is that guy doing, what mechanism of action is going on? And are those both, is that all fraud? And are they deceiving each other? Are they together on the, just like it's thorny. Anyway, so yeah, I posted about this on a couple of Facebook groups. One was the Thoughtful Saints group, Jacob Hanson's group. One was the Western Esotericism, and the other one was the Latter-day Lobsters, the Jordan Peterson one. And I posted it in the Thoughtful Saints group, and it was really just about John Dee and the case, and that quote that I just read, and just said I would be interested to hear how believers reconcile this or non-believers. And somebody responded, the Hurlbut affidavits are lies, and the truth contained in about 1/5 of them was exaggerated, as all false accusations are. And I responded, I said, I didn't cite anything from the Hurlbut affidavits. And he said, actually you did, but seemed to not know it. It took a lot of strength to not respond. But I don't quite know what he's saying, but it was an interesting, like, psychological something to analyze of that, if anything's thrown up that is difficult to reconcile, like the mind just retrieves the closest thing to a satisfactory answer and throws it out there, even though, because that's the defense that the Joseph Smith Foundation people use, that like Joseph Smith didn't practice any magic, because these Hurlbut accusations used in the but they were from like 1834, and there's so many other accounts of other things of Joseph Smith doing, into a cult. So it was interesting to see how that person processed or reconciled this.
I think it's fascinating. Like John Dee, Terence said that he had one of the largest libraries in the country or whatever. I see Joseph Smith as someone, maybe he wasn't collecting like physical books in a library, but the way that he integrated all of this stuff makes me think that he was exposed to a lot of ideas from a lot of people. There was work on the canal going on nearby, which brought people from all over the country. I mean, you could be exposed to a lot of different ideas of people just talking. And history is so much about what's been written that but what gets written down is only such a small fraction of what was being talked about and what was being shared. And, I think Jesus was also one of these people who had cultural exposure, going to Egypt, being visited by magi, like having a childhood where he kind of moved about, and Buddha was someone who was raised in an incredibly wealthy household and had definitely had exposure to writings and things that, from other cultures. It's that diversity of culture. We've got to assimilate it, bring it into a unification with the light from which the source of it all comes from. And then that person that's able to do that turns around and tries to share it, and then it gets filtered, and then it gets all cloudy. And then we've got to do it again as new information emerges. It's like we're pushing into the darkness in science and in all of these philosophical thought, all of these frontiers of uncertainty and unknown. And then spirituality is condensing all of the light in the place and trying to hold it into one magical moment. And then it's gone. And then we've got to push more, and then we've got to do it again. I think that religions just need to go through these cycles in order to maintain the spirituality of it. And I think that people are having these phenomenon, these experiences, these altered states of consciousness, these mystical states, and they're kind of at one end of that bell curve. Like everybody, like as a human, we have the capacity to have those experiences, and some of us actually do.
I think religion's time is up. And this is what Carl Jung says in his lectures on Kundalini Yoga, is that he just talks about like, hey, look, you've got these, society has these models, and they work for a certain while to bring about some level of societal consciousness. But you have to make sure you don't let them overstay their welcome. You don't keep clinging to them when you've transcended them. And he talks about East and West kind of meeting. But I think now you can reconcile science and religion and spirituality. But it's like, spirituality is kind of a fraught term that for a lot of people they associate with religion. Science is kind of a fraught term because even for me, I associate it with materialist perspectives. And so like, what do we call it now?
Yeah.
When it's scientific idealism and philosophy and spirituality. It
will be something else. The creation of a new term is the birth of a new idea. And if there is a way forward with like religions of old in the future, they've got to go through this process, this like it's basically fire and pressure and heat and it's almost like people, it's like there's this lever, which is like when the religion isn't doing it for people, the people leave the religion, and then the religion adjusts, changes, or uses power dynamics at its disposal to the extent that it has them to like reissue the narrative, like reinvigorate the narrative, restore the narrative, and then bring people back to it, and then it goes again. It just kind of like breathes. And religion will change. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I think though, like for me, I think how can you have religion, at least in any way that we know of religion, without God and Satan, without good and evil, heaven and hell, righteousness and sin, when we're moving into positive and negative, oneness and individual. It's not that everything's okay and there's not an ideal way to do things. It's just that you're switching from kind of like a moralistic judgment into like, you actually don't need evil to have good. I mean, you could just have love with the other polarity being, separation. And so yeah, I don't know how it survives, how it updates the framework of good and evil, damnation, hell. I think some religions can have maybe, but more like Eastern religions where they weren't built on that duality in the first place. So it'll be interesting. I think that, you see, what people focus on, the people that are kind of looking at society and seeing moral decay, looking at the rates of people leaving religion. But what they're not focusing on is that more and more people are identifying as spiritual as ever before. And so they're just focusing on people leaving religion. But there's actually another side that's positive.
Yeah, until it can be put into a new wrapper that is acceptable as religion, even if it has to change its name altogether from religion. But in effect, it will be the same thing, because when you have a religion that's, I think, effective, it's spirituality executing at a community level rather than an individual level to some extent, right? At least that's how Western, a lot of that's Christianity for the most part, is looking at a different scale.
I think religion is a hierarchy or structure, whereas true spirituality, and this is like the battle that played out, if you read Brian Murarescu's book, The Immortality Key, that like the Gnostic religion, the religions that had the psychedelic sacrament that promised, divine union through the actual sacrament, through mystical experience. You don't need a church. You don't need to pay tithing. You don't need a priest. It's democratized. And so I think, there's a lot of people that stay within religion because they want meaning in their life and they want community. But I think people are finding that you can have meaning without religion. You can find that in this integration of science and philosophy and spirituality, and then I think the community piece is slowly coming together too. I go to there's a Sangha, meditation group that meets here, and I have post-Mormon people monthly, and then the friend that I was with yesterday, she just started going into a Zen Buddhist meditation center that they have multiple meetings a week, and she's meeting community there. So it'll be interesting to see. I think that we've kind of reached the next level of evolution. I think non-human intelligence, aliens, AI, psychedelics, as well as just like the polarization of politics and wealth inequality and the climate crisis. I mean, I think it's all, we're at a threshold to an interesting new future. Well, I think that was the most interesting parts of Terence McKenna's talk. I thought that John Dee stuff was fascinating. I knew a little bit about it. And so we're going to wrap things up there. A couple thoughts. I want to see if anybody had any interest. We're thinking about doing maybe a live show, call-in show. So if you wanted to drop us an email and any thoughts, interest in that, Mormons, mystics, and muons at gmail.com, as well as if anyone was interested in getting involved, but not necessarily wanting to, be on the camera or recording, but wanted to help with like thumbnails for the podcast or intro video or something. Not very polished, but if anybody has those skills and wants to get involved, and please leave us reviews on Apple Podcasts or ratings on Spotify, and we'll try to get back into a little more regular routine of posting things. Try to have some of those episodes maybe on Sunstone or talk about Method Infinite when I finish it. There's some other books. So, all right, thanks for joining us for this episode. Good talking to you, Alton.
Thanks, Gabe. Always a pleasure.
All right, take care, everybody.
Bye now.